What's going on, guys? Welcome to episode 23 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Real quick, we just want to take a second to thank everyone for the awesome launch we had for the second version of Data Driven Strength Individualized Programming. Josh and I and the rest of the team have had that in the work for quite a few months now. We were just super excited to get it out to a bunch of the lifters and see what you guys think. Overall, it's been super positive feedback, and we're just excited to continue to build that community over there and continue to build the product out to make it something we're really excited about. So don't want to plug that too long here, but just wanted to take a quick second to thank everyone for that. And if you want to learn more, obviously you can go check it out in the description of this episode or on either Josh Vai's profile on Instagram. We'll take you to the links to the website. Okay, without out of the way, today, standard Q&A episode. Josh and I have a few questions on deck here from Instagram. We'll go through these one by one and see if we can deliver some half-decent answers. So, first one we have for you, Mr. Josh, and this one is from Jackie Leung. Thank you, Jackie, as always. Asked some really good questions. One of the lifters in our Data-Driven Strength Individualized Programming group. He is asking, what is your favorite exercise for each muscle group? We're going to touch on a few here for the shorten and lengthen position.
Yes, this is a really good question, and I'm guessing this was kind of prompted by some recent stuff we've been putting up, based on kind of like a recent study that came out comparing like preacher curls in the top half of the range of motion compared to the bottom half of the range of motion. But anyway, this has been something we've been thinking about a lot recently, and trying to brush up on some of the literature. I think just right off the bat, we need to be a little bit careful with our terms here and make sure we're kind of talking about the same thing. So I think the obvious way in which an exercise can be more quote unquote lengthened is if there's just like a mechanical reason for why you can reach a more stretched position for the muscle group. So for example, instead of doing RDLs to like midway down your shins, you can do RDLs all the way to the floor, or you can do deficit RDLs all the way to the floor, right? So you just kind of have that logistical consideration based on the exercise that you selected. Another consideration here is just based on the biomechanics of the movement, the muscle length or the part of the range of motion at which it is most difficult. So super simple example here is the squat versus the leg extension, right? In a squat, most people fail at the bottom, right? Or at least near the bottom. For a leg extension, typically you fail because you can't lock out the leg extension. So it's not necessarily that you're exposing yourself to a longer knee extension range of motion in the squat, but instead it's just based on the demands of the exercise, the length of the muscle or the part of the knee extension range of motion at which it is most difficult. So anyway, with that out of the way, I just wanted to kind of be cautious right there and not just throw around these terms that can kind of be difficult to interpret. But anyway, I'll get into some of the specifics of Jackie's questions Jackie's question here. I'll start with the lower body, so I'll go over the hamstrings and then the quads. Then I'll kick it over to you, Zach. You can go over a few upper body muscles. So the first is the hamstrings. This one we're actually lucky enough to have some direct data on it. So there's a recent study that compared seated leg curls and prone leg curls, and basically, at least with the machines that the researchers used in this study, the individuals were able to reach a longer hamstrings muscle length in the seated position, and the seated position did see greater muscle growth in the hamstrings, potentially indicating that, hey, if you have the option, go ahead and roll with the seated leg curl over the prone leg curl when possible. Is that always going to be black and white? No, but might be a good kind of starting point for most people. Now, if you have the ability to kind of manipulate your leg curl machine in order to make it harder at the top, so in the case of a seated leg curl, or I guess more so at the bottom of a prone leg curl, that would be awesome. Now, again, we're kind of extrapolating based on some of this like muscle length research. Like I don't want to claim that, hey, that change from making it most difficult at the bottom of a seated leg curl to making it most difficult at the top of a seated leg curl is gonna, you know, considerably change the benefits. We don't necessarily have that direct evidence right now, but again, I think there's kind of enough vectors pointing in that direction of, hey, in general, it seems like a good rule of thumb that if you can make the exercise more difficult in that more lengthened position. So, in the case of the seated leg curl, because you're able to expose yourself to a longer hamstrings muscle length, hey, if you can also make it more difficult there as opposed to failing at the bottom, that there might be a benefit there. So, anyway, the reason I bring that up is because Zach and I have recently been training leg curl, and we're able to manipulate our machine so that the failure point is actually at the top in that lengthened position. You can also slightly bend over a little bit. Now, when you bend over, you want to make sure that's you're not bending over just from back flexion. So you kind of want to keep your chest out and bend over and get a really good stretch in the hamstrings at the top. And if you make that your failure point, trust me, all you need is a couple sets and you're good to go. So anyway, probably a little bit too much time spent on the hamstring curl directly. The next thing I'll say for hamstrings is we are huge fans of longer than normal range of motion hip extension movements. So I I feel like I can pretty reliably increase somebody's deadlift if we just have them do a really, really good RDL to the floor, or depending on their leverages, potentially get them on a deficit. Um, I just that's just like probably one of the most widely applicable exercises we found is just get a really, really good strict um, stiff like deadlift movement where you're really controlling it all the way to the bottom, taking those hamstrings through a long muscle length. So that would kind of cover it for the hamstrings. I didn't really mention any shortened ones because my head has kind of been on lengthened ones, but I'll just go ahead and move on to the quads. For the quads, pretty similar story here. Um, at least within our equipment availability, I really dig our belt squat setup for uh, a lengthened one. So obviously with a squat, you're going to fail at the bottom, and then same idea with the leg extension. We've been able to manipulate that to make it hardest at the bottom, so at the lengthened position. We can also kind of almost extend our hips fully in order to get the rectus femoris nice and lengthened at the bottom. Um, I'll hold off on too long of a ramble on that specifically. That's kind of where my head's at with hamstring and quads. Again, I kind of focus on the lengthened stuff because I do think that's a good rule of thumb. Does everything have to be kind of a lengthened overload? No, but that's kind of where my head's been at. So anyway, I'll kick it over to you, Zach.
That's exactly what I was just going to hit on. I really like the way that Jackie phrased this question because I do think a lot of our content and our thought process, like you touched on, Josh, has been on the lengthened position stuff, just because that's kind of what the recent research has kind of highlighted. But I do think it's very important to realize that, as always, this area of research is in its infancy. I don't think we have a study, to my knowledge, that has kind of combined positions. I'd be curious to see if that would lead to better regional hypertrophy, like a more uniform hypertrophy across the muscle. Obviously, we have that older study by Fonseca and colleagues that always has kind of floated around in the back of the minds in terms of varying the exercise selection there and probably the position in which the exercise is most difficult, to have kind of more uniform muscle growth. So that's always something I want to keep in mind is when we're talking about this shortened and lengthened stuff. It's not like exercises that are most difficult in a shortened position have zero utility. That's definitely not the case. And I think when we start talking about, Josh, like you said, the seated hamstrings, particularly in the way that we've been doing them, 2 sets and you are smoked. Now, from a per set stimulus perspective, obviously that seems to be, really, really efficient, but there may be a utility in the opposite direction of like, hey, if we're doing a few more sets of this stuff at a shorter muscle length, who's to say that doesn't have some sort of benefit in terms of volume accumulation? So I just wanted to clear that up and just say, definitely been focusing on the length and stuff. And as Josh said, I think that we think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. But there's a lot to be learned here, especially in the practical sphere of like pairing these exercises to utilize them for different purposes, fatigue management, all that kind of stuff. So excited to give the shortened position some love here as well. Okay, with that being said, moving into the chest for me. I think it's probably no secret, anybody that's watched my training clips, the lengthened position, or the kind of the more stretch dominant movement for me is definitely a deficit weighted push up. Just been something that, you know, it's a lot of anecdote shrouded in it for me, because that was like the one movement I started doing, and my bench finally kind of broke the plateau that I had for a really long time. So like I've just really enjoyed that movement. But since then, I've continued to refine it to really have a really strong mind muscle connection for myself. And it's one of the only movements I can kind of feel a really strong stretch in my pecs without having very much shoulder discomfort, which has always been something that's kind of struggled for me. So maybe something to give a shot if you've always been somebody that's dumbbell pressed or feet up bench, that kind of thing. I think that stretch is something that's really, really good in that movement. For a short position, I would say probably no surprise, probably some sort of chest fly there that is particularly challenging in that position where you're really flexing your pecs and focusing on the adduction component of the pecs action there. That's would be my favorite. Moving over to back, I would say this is where, I don't know, just just our training experience. I feel like the past few weeks has just highlighted how individual this is. Um, for me, I mean, obviously the length and position for back stuff is difficult, right? That's the one that we've kind of have talked a ton about in terms of kind of having to get creative to do this stuff. There's definitely some ways you can kind of manipulate your body angle and stuff like that to kind of get at that. But I would say some sort of like unilateral lat pull down, especially doing partials after you've kind of reached the full range of motion failure, has been my favorite for that personally. And kind of the shorter muscle length. It's kind of a cheat answer, but those lat pullovers with a straight bar on a cable machine, it's also a lengthened movement, if depending on the way you do it. But like the contraction there at the bottom has been something I've really, really enjoyed. As Josh and I have been training together, he's been having he's introduced those to me, so I've really enjoyed those as well. But yeah, man, it looks like we have shoulders here on our list as well, and I think you want to share something for there. But those are kind of my answers for those muscle groups.
Yeah, I'm gonna give a very high level uh, overview of like some stuff we've been playing around with shoulders because shout out to Jake who um, he's working on some stuff directly related to pre-exhaust that we'll be releasing here soon. But we can kind of, I think there's like Zach said, our heads have kind of been like, hey, how can we overload the lengthened position? But there's definitely like a ton of different ways we could potentially apply some of these concepts. Hey, in general, an RDL to the floor can smoke you compared to a hamstring curl machine that is really just hard at lockout, right? Like those can really be two different exercises or two different feelings for the next couple days after training. So anyway, another way to potentially incorporate both these shortened overloaded and lengthened overloaded exercises would be to pair them either in a direct superset type fashion or just doing one exercise first and then the other, right? Carry some fatigue from that first exercise into the second exercise. But anyway, something we've been playing around with is doing like lateral raises. So those are going to overload the shortened position because everybody knows that a dumbbell lateral raise is hardest once you kind of get your arms up to 90 degrees. And then when you directly after finishing that set, you can go into an overhead press, and it seems to kind of make the lateral delts the limiting factor in a lengthened position, which is typically pretty hard with lateral raise variations. So in other words, you go over to the barbell or the dumbbells for whatever overhead press variation you're doing, and at the bottom you feel a ton of tension, or just the limiting factor seems to be the lateral delts in that lengthened position. Go
I
for
would
it,
say
Zach.
the only caveat there is that I would say it's more of a relative term there. It's a more lengthened position because I
Right.
think the lateral delt, in order to stretch that fully, you'd actually need to like pull it behind your back almost.
Yeah.
So I think it's just a relative term there, but I absolutely think that's something that I've really enjoyed that we've been doing as well. The last thing I just wanted to add on here is we're definitely not inventing this stuff. I think we've just
Oh yeah,
been
yeah.
we've been
We've been
we've been
having fun
playing.
with it, man.
Yeah, so we've been playing around a lot of this stuff in our training, just kind of juice things up as we've kind of been getting after it in the mornings together the last couple of weeks. So yeah, just wanted to add that in there too. But
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's
And
been fun playing around with it.
Yeah, like I just wouldn't take the first 15 minutes of this episode too seriously. Like just kind of use this as like idea fuel. Cuz like for example, I'm blanking on the first author's name, but this is a study I reviewed a couple weeks ago that I mentioned earlier. Like if you look at the sites that were measured along the length of the bicep, just I'm just kind of looking at the percent changes subjectively here. Um, Only one of the sites seemed to be pretty meaningfully different, right? So that just goes to Zach's point that we still have a lot to learn here. We have a lot to learn about the proximity to failure question and how that influences regional hypertrophy. We have a lot to learn about kind of overloading the lengthened or the shortened position. So like maybe just take everything as idea fuel because go for it.
I just want to note, as I see the recording time here, it has now been officially approximately 15 minutes, and we have not said the words proximity to failure in a podcast.
Let's go.
Big record
We
there.
are. All right, we're gonna move on. I think we've done that justice. Jackie, I hope that was good enough, man. Okay, so we'll take the second question here. This is from Espen Vika. Is that correct? All right, awesome. Okay, so um, this question is thoughts on proactively adding sets for hypertrophy.
Yeah, so this is a good one. I think obviously I think Josh actually wrote an article on this a while ago. I forget how long ago as we published that, but it was Josh headed that one up and put that on the 3DMJ website when this kind of discussion was really getting hot about. Was that a year ago? I don't even know. Um, See, it was a while ago. Josh doesn't give
All
me any.
all the months kind of blend together the
Yeah,
last couple of years.
I have no idea. It was a while ago, but yeah, if you want to kind of take a deep dive on this and some of our thoughts, that's a good article to check out. But I think as the conversation on this has kind of evolved, I think one thing Josh pointed out to me when we were kind of reviewing the outline here is like really nobody's advocating for proactively adding sets really aggressively anymore. I would say. Um, it's more so like how aggressive should we be with the signaling to reactively add sets. I guess is really the time scale in which that occurs. So I think one thing in this conversation pretty much everybody agrees on is like intro weeks or gradually introducing workload is an example of proactively adding sets to some degree that probably is okay. But from there, in terms of managing volumes for hypertrophy specifically, I think that's where just how comfortable you are with your activity in which you add sets is going to change depending on the way you program. So you know, as far as like, am I going to set up a training block that linearly increases sets for somebody for hypertrophy? Almost never, like we said, with the exception of intro weeks. But I think depending on the way that you view programming for hypertrophy, I think you can come to different answers in terms of the time scale in which you're going to reactively add sets. That's kind of a total cop out there, but I mean that's kind of the way I view this is like depending on preference. It's just like it's like a lot of things. It's like you can design a training block for hypertrophy. And we always talk with Jake about this. It sucks because hypertrophy training really doesn't seem to be complicated on the surface. There's a ton of different ways to get to Rome. It's kind of a choose your own adventure type of thing. I'm sure you could set up a training block that is a little bit more aggressive in reactively adding sets that is going to lead to perfectly sufficient outcomes in comparison to one that maybe does that a little bit more conservatively. Is that going to matter over the course of 20 years? You could probably make an argument in either direction, but I don't have particularly strong views on this at the moment. Yeah, just total political office answer right there, Josh. What do you got?
Yeah, man. I don't think I have much to add there. I would just mention that in that article, I think something I didn't or we didn't mention enough is that like we kind of made the assumption that if you are taking this more liberal approach to adding sets, that um, that you think kind of like the amount of training volume that you can benefit from shifts on a week to week basis, and that was kind of the overall point that we made in that article. Is like that's probably not the case, right? Somebody actually commented on that article, and the more that I've thought about their comment, the more I think it's a good point. And basically, as I remember the comment, they said like, "Hey, great stuff, but I think a lot of people that apply this more liberal approach to adding sets will start below what they can maximally benefit from to kind of give themselves a runway. So honestly, like if you see, hey, we have that article out there, you're like, oh, we're more on the static sets side of things. But like, I think, I think it just depends how you set it up overall and like the overall context. And a parallel in kind of the strength training world that I actually think is that I think is pretty interesting here is like the way that Mike T and RTS set up things is like the the way they set up their individualization process doesn't require periodization, but another strength coach could, you know, like potentially see benefits from periodization, um, but they kind of set it up to see benefits from periodization. So I think it's a similar concept there in terms of like this whole adding sets debate for hypertrophy, in that like if you kind of start conservatively, start with, you know, maybe a few more reps in the tank, and then you are reactive with it. I think it's a totally reasonable approach. Um, I'll give an example of how I'm using that right now. I have an athlete that uh, recently just transitioned from more of a powerlifting focus to more of a physique focus, and we're being pretty reactive week to week. I will say I'm being pretty conservative because do I think in his first training block with this transition that he needs to do, 10 sets of calves or upwards of like 8 to 10 sets on movements he hasn't trained in years? No, but that is kind of a middle ground scenario where I'll use it. So anyway, I hope that kind of makes sense. I just think that both options are viable, and it's also not a dichotomy. I think a lot of people in the static sets camp will use intro weeks, right, which is typically a proactive, like, hey, we're going to strategically hold you back for 1 or 2 weeks. And then also they'll be like, hey, if we're deloading next week anyway for the last week of the block, maybe we'll push those RPs a little bit higher. Maybe we'll add a set, something like that. So it ends up looking pretty similar anyway. So yeah,
I
go for
think
it, Zach.
one more thing to add is I think another example of like how this we could maybe have another analogy to compare this to is kind of the RER accuracy, and how frequently maybe you should do like an RER audit or like train to failure to kind of uh, check your work almost. I guess the real philosophical point of like the benefit to the adding sets model, I guess, in the way that it's colloquially applied, is like you kind of get to see where the edge of the cliff is for an individual. And really that only matters if we look at like the meta-analysis on training volume for hypertrophy, there's obviously diminishing returns in a very significant amount. So if you're very close to the cliff already, seeing the edge of the cliff probably doesn't actually make a difference over the long run. But if you're at the bottom of the mountain, then it might. So like if you're one of those people that like maybe is like significantly undershooting the amount of training volume you're recovering from, you're performing on a week to week basis that you can recover from, I could see benefits to the adding sets approach, similar to how if you're somebody who's training with 20 reps in reserve on squats and you're calling every set 8 RPE, training to failure might actually be something you want to take into consideration, because all the other approaches that we talk about are with the understanding that you have a rough anchoring of what that actually means. So I think that's similar with training volume. Like if you know what it is to really push your recovery balance in terms of training volume, you probably don't need to add sets as aggressively, because you already know what kind of where you're at in terms of the proximity to the edge of that cliff. So that's kind of one thing I just thought about now that I think is probably a pretty good analogy, which is why people like Dr. Eric Helms, all these guys that have been training for so long and have probably experimented with coming up to the edge of that cliff, maybe are not as fond of that approach, just because the diminishing returns there just simply don't make sense. But I'm sure you could construct a scenario in which maybe that would be a move you would want to consider. I don't know if you have anything final thoughts there.
Yeah, I think I agree, but the crux of this is that you could take the adding sets approach to find where the edge of that cliff is, but it's not a perfect way to find the edge of that cliff,
For
if that
sure.
makes sense,
Yeah,
right? So like
it's it's a
that
it's a moving mountain, right? It's
well, there's that component that it's dynamic, but there's also the component that like the way you got there confounds things, right? So
Right.
if
Right.
right, and also like everything is influenced by, again, I just go back to the way you set things up, man. Like I just think
Hmm.
like I don't want to be like too hand wavy here, but I just think everything can work within a given context, and that's like, do we generally advocate training for failure? No, but I think you can get really like dang near the same benefits, at least for hypertrophy, if you take every set to failure, um, but you just set it up a little bit differently, right? Maybe in terms of exercise selection, maybe in terms of rep ranges or in set volume, etc. Like all these different components of program design can work in a given context, and they all influence each other. So going back to what we're talking about with lengthened versus shortened, if you're doing if you're doing like the way we have the hamstring curls set up that we were talking about, your your edge of the cliff might be 6 sets of those per week or even less. But if you change the exercise selection for the hamstrings there, your edge of the cliff might be 13, right? So it's just all this stuff is dynamic. But I anyway, I generally agree with you. I just wanted to add that caveat that you can't actually know because of how you got there, and also people like to conflate how something feels in the moment or how they feel
Hmm.
for the next 7 days or whatever with how effective the training session was, which I'm not saying that's a bad way to go, and not to listen to to your body,
Right.
but that's also not perfect as well.
Right.
In the absence of having a better alternative, yes, that's a great way to
I,
go
I
for sure.
suppose what I was speaking of was speaking in probabilities, but of course, as you said, like
Right.
the analogy that was just continuing to build in my mind is like, depending on where you start at the bottom of the mountain, you start to climb up, you could get to like a cliff that you think is the actual summit, but it's not
Yeah.
actually it, depending on
Yeah.
where you start in the mountain. So I think,
Right. Like,
uh,
and we see this with strength training a lot too. Like, um people feel like they can handle more volume and you give it to them, but then things just I don't want to say fall apart, but things get a little bit messier, right? You have more variation in performance on a session to session or week to week basis. You're not able to sustain the block length. But hey man, I felt good after that week of training. I feel like I can handle more. But it's like, hey, let's in a lot of cases, like, hey, let's just hang out here. Let's hang out here. Let's see what happens. I have a client who he's like 2 months in, or like 2.5 months now into training back in the gym after 7 months of being in lockdown. Um, in that case, like, hey man, I feel like I can handle more. Like I can handle more training stress. Trust me. But I'm like, no, like everything is going. You're hitting PRs from before lockdown. Like, yes, I understand that you feel like you can handle more, and maybe we'll sprinkle that in for adherence reasons, and always give them kind of listen to them and give them some of what they want, etc. But I think you can fall into that fallacy of almost listening too much to and relying too much on how it subjectively feels in the moment in the acute term, as opposed to being more outcome oriented. Um, Obviously, you need a little bit of both, but ramble's over.
yep. All right, we're done. Let's move to the next one.
Cool.
Last question I hit on here. This is one of the questions we got was kind of this was, oh man, I'm gonna butcher the name. Ah,
I don't even know where you're looking, man.
uh, starts with an I right here. IAC PWL. IAC powerlifting. I'm assuming.
Dude, I don't even see an I. Where are you seeing? Oh, there is an I.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That's
Yeah, no, I
I'm
got
going.
it.
I'm going with that. That's the story. I'm sticking to it. Okay, so basically, he had a question about we talk about kind of our general model of periodization, which again is suspect to individualization, all that kind of stuff. It's not static. It's not super rigid. But basically, his question was like, when we're doing one of these strength phases, how would you modify that approach or do anything slightly different when you're in a deficit nutritionally? Basically, this just got me thinking. Like we've been talking a ton about, as I've alluded to, we've kind of been, Josh and I have been training together in the morning. Had some just general discussion, and one of the things we've been talking a lot about is just being intentional with the nutritional strategy you're trying to implement. Which again, not rocket science. We're not rewriting anything here. This is pretty well known, but
That
just
was a really great idea, Zach. That was awesome.
yeah, I mean,
Groundbreaking stuff.
just really. If you're gonna try to do something, you should try to do it. I mean, it's pretty novel ideas here, but basically the idea being, um, progress just seems to be a lot more reliable when you're like very intentional with the nutritional approach you're attempting to implement, in kind of trying to periodize that in some fashion, um, in accordance with the training goal at the time. And we were recalling times in our training career, like when I'm in a very solid surplus and I'm checking that box and I'm doing everything the right way, progress just seems to come to me. And similar with a deficit in hypertrophy phase, you're really trying to be intentional about that. Do everything the right way, keep your protein high, that kind of stuff. You seem to maintain much more strength and if not gain it, that kind of stuff. So we were basically just been talking about that quite a bit. So I just kind of wanted to kick that topic around. So Josh, off of that, where do you want to go with it?
Did you did you say the question or no?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of just like a general topic. Like I
Okay,
said,
okay,
IAC PWL's question. Hopefully, I got that right once again. Basically, it was like, how do you modify training in
okay,
one of
okay.
these strength
You
phases
might
on
have
a
said it. Okay,
deficit? Yeah, I did.
okay,
And then just kind of just opening that nutritional periodization topic a little more broadly.
okay. So I think an easy place to start here is let's think about somebody that cares about strength, and let's just kind of assume that's the goal. Um, as we've talked about a lot before, we think a very, very good investment is try to grow the prime movers as much as possible, um, for long term strength development. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into strength. Don't get me wrong, but from a long term perspective, you're going to set yourself up really, really well if you put on as much muscle mass as possible. So, to that end, we don't really like to go for extended periods of time without really good, without training that would support um, uh, like good hypertrophic outcomes. But if you are going to, have a time in which you are, focusing on body composition changes, so either doing a dedicated calorie surplus or a dedicated calorie deficit, we would generally bias those more towards a training block that is biased towards hypertrophy, right? Because in general, if we're in a deficit, that's going to give us our best bet of maintaining as much lean mass as possible. Now, to be clear, if you're a strength athlete, you're probably not getting down to like super low levels of body fat. You're probably not going to be in a super dramatic deficit. So that's probably not a huge concern. Anyway, um, but again, we kind of bias that more hypertrophy focused training to times when you are going to strategically increase or decrease body weight. And then in a strength phase, we typically lean more towards being at calorie maintenance. So in general, we're not huge fans of being in a deficit in that strength phase. Can you do it? Absolutely. We've had people, have success with that all the time. But in general, like, hey, if you're able to be at maintenance or in a surplus in that strength phase, that's going to be really helpful, in order to make things as predictable as possible. In a strength phase, we're looking to maximize peak intensity. In general, you can just make things more reliable, kind of check the box of the strength phase a little bit better, if you're not in a deficit. So, anyway, to directly answer the question of how to modify a strength phase in a deficit, I would say, first and foremost, if you are, like, I would prefer that you do that deficit in a more hypertrophy bias phase, right off the bat. But let's say you have a good amount of body fat to lose and you are going to go through with that. I think that's absolutely fine. You're going to be totally fine. I don't think you need to completely overhaul the training. I think one thing that can go a really, really long way is to be a little bit more liberal in terms of how auto regulated you are with top sets. So, something that I've been implementing with myself recently, just giving myself a very wide range in terms of top sets. So typically I would say, hey, work up to a triple at 7 to 8, right? A rather narrow range. But now it's more like, hey, work up to a triple at 5 to 8.5. So that allows you to really take advantage of the good days, but also not bury yourself in additional fatigue on days you don't feel as good. So that's an idea you might want to run with. Um, that's what comes to mind for me. In terms of training volume, that's typically not something we will proactively adjust, but I don't know if you want to take that and run with it, Zach.
The primary thing I've been thinking a lot about in these kinds of questions, like going back to IP a bit, we've got quite a few messages in the Facebook recently about how to modify training with very, very high life stress. And one thing that often comes back to me is, like you said, Josh, the goal of a strength phase is to maximize peak intensity. But I think you can take that out a little bit further, and that could provide some further directives. So it's to maximize peak intensity on the lifts that you're trying to improve in that block primarily. And what that leads me to say is that really what we're trying to do is maximize peak intensity on those primary sessions. And so oftentimes what I see and what seems to help kind of combat some of these negative life stressors, one of those being a caloric deficit, is to really polarize, the way that you're thinking about those training sessions. So a secondary session, I'm not saying to sleepwalk through it. Obviously, this is something we've said 100 times. You got to be very, have a ton of intent when you're training, bring a ton of effort. But the point being, some days you're just not going to have it, and that's going to, the percentage of times that's going to be the case when you don't have favorable environment for training, caloric deficit, high life stress. Maybe your relationship is kind of stressful at the moment. That's going to increase the percentages of the time that's going to happen, and you just need to accept that and auto regulate appropriately. And especially that is the case on those secondary sessions. I find because there's not as familiarity with the movement, maybe you don't immediately pick up when you're warming up on like a tempo squat. Man, strength's a little down today. That often can lead to those sessions getting, increasingly more stressful as the block goes on. And now you're kind of, coming at it from both ends. You don't have a favorable environment to tolerate a ton of training stress. And the planned training stress is now getting increased and exacerbated over time because you're not treating a session the way that it's meant to be treated. And the planned training stress is increasing over time. So I think really taking those secondary days and those hypertrophy slots to the RPEs that are assigned in a strength phase, or however you have it set up, I think is really, really important, and really trying to isolate and focus that effort and in that intensity where you're trying to maximize strength in that kind of short to moderate term. So that's something I think is really, really important and becomes pretty prevalent the more kind of negative life stressors you kind of stack on top of one another, with this stuff kind of coming around. So that was the first thing that came to mind for me.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize a couple things. So, if the goal is if the goal is strength, right? That's probably why you're doing a strength walk. In general, I believe I mentioned this before, like you're not going to be in a nutritional status that's just completely not conducive to uh, your training outcomes, right? Again, like I said, you're probably not going to be getting to super low levels of body fat. You're probably not going to be in a super long calorie deficit, or a calorie deficit for a super long time, right? Like you could probably get most of your fat loss phases done within one or two training blocks and kind of bias those towards hypertrophy phases. Of course, that's going to be very individual dependent, based on kind of where that individual is at. The next thing I wanted to mention is that I also want to be clear that we don't mean to oversimplify this stuff. I think it's a great take home, that, like, hey, in general, we think a lot of strength trainees that really want to drive up their numbers to make sure their weight gain is detectable over time, make sure they're having some degree of nutritional periodization. We think that can pay off, but there's a ton that goes into this, right? Like if I have an athlete that's on the more competitive side compared to somebody that's more on the recreational side, that's going to influence it a lot. Some athletes are just more focused on the process. They just enjoy that. They're not interested in putting on extra body fat, and they'll consciously make the decision of leaving some kilos on the table for that more for that more sustainable lifestyle, if you will, or for that preferred approach. that's absolutely fine. And these are all things you have to keep in mind. So again, I just want to emphasize that we don't mean to oversimplify it. Um, and to circle back to what I said before about strength athletes probably never having to be in a nutritional status that is completely not conducive to their training goals, is that a lot of people can uh, have negative expectations about how that training is going to go. There was a recent paper that came out like probably like 36 hours ago from the time of recording this. So we're not going to go in depth of that because we haven't read it in depth because it's so new. um, it's called Energy Deficiency Impairs Resistance Training Gains in Lean Mass but Not Strength, a meta-analysis and meta-regression by Murphy and Kohler. Anyway, kind of the broad strokes. Take home, again, take this with a grain of salt because this isn't something we've gotten a chance to dive into in too much detail quite yet. But take home is that based on kind of the studies that they pulled together in this analysis, strength gains were not hindered to a huge degree, at least in comparison to gains in lean body mass. So I think a lot of people can just get negative expectations when they are in a fat loss phase. But I think with good programming, keeping the goal of the set a goal, kind of using some periodization strategies, make sure you're checking your boxes, that you can. I think people can make a lot of progress in calorie deficits, especially if you're being intentful. If you're going into a fat loss phase, you're not you know spending 2 weeks and then blowing it, and then next thing you know it's 4 months later and you still haven't gotten the fat off. Like just kind of being intentful, dipping your toes in, getting back into ideally a small surplus. So um, anyway, that's kind of my thoughts there. Looking forward to reading that paper in a bit more depth. But Zach, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, honestly, man, I think that's it. That's good on your end.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, guys, for joining us here on episode 23. As always, you can leave us a hopefully positive rating and review on whatever platform you're listening this to. And then we can see you the next time we're on here. And hopefully, we'll continue to kick that rating up and hopefully be able to deliver you guys some more good episodes. As I talked about at the beginning of the show, if you're interested in checking out Data Driven Strength Individualized Programming, the link will be in the description, and you can always head over to our website at data-drivenstrength.com/programs. Check that out. All the information is there. And of course, let us know if you have any questions. Take care, guys, and we'll see you next time.